Welcome to the Stocks on the Rock Show. Whether you like it neat, on the rocks, chilled, or warm, everybody's happier when there's money in their account and a drink in their glass. Let's get started. What's up, everybody? Welcome to another edition of Stocks on the Rocks, where we talk about two of my favorite things on the planet, the markets, and maybe a wee dram while we do it. And today we're going to talk about a topic that has been rolling around in people's minds. I've actually gotten a couple of requests for this. We're going to talk about Brexit. And how does Brexit impact the U.S. economy, the global economy, and the Great British Pound overall? Now, I figure if we're going to talk about Brexit, then it's probably not a good idea to drink American whiskeys. So today, we've got Laphroaig. So we're going Laphroaig today, quarter cask blend. It's, they say, the perfect marriage of peat and oak. So we're going to be drinking Laphroaig today. I've had a couple of you ask me specifically about the bottle that's usually sitting back there. This is just the nice box that Laphroaig goes in. And Laphroaig is a very unique Scotch in my mind, and it comes from the island of Islay, which is in the Hebrides. And Islay is it's not overly remote, but it appears to be remote when you look at it. Now, one of the things about Laphroaig is that it's very unique in its flavor profile. Immediately, when this is poured, you get the smell of peat, right? I mean, peat just comes off the nose, but not overpoweringly. There's some sweetness kind of, lingering behind it. Now, I poured this one a couple of minutes ago to kind of give it some opportunity to kind of open up a little bit. So I'll talk a little bit about this particular distillery, and there's a great YouTube video, which is a little distillery tour that I watched. And one of the things I like about it is it told a little bit of the history of the story about the water, where everything comes from. And the water actually has a flavor of peat because the peat is so strong in this particular island. You know, he pulled out a water from the reservoir, and that the water, you actually might have mistaken it for whiskey because of the color, but it's really all the peat that's in it. They said about 20% of the flavor comes from the water itself. So when I take a little sip, immediately you get hit with flavors of smoke. The smoke hits you almost immediately. It's almost like you actually just had a cigar. I feel like I just smoked a cigar. That feeling in your mouth right after you have a cigar, kind of lingering in the background. And I just took a very, very small amount to kind of feel the flavors, and it opens up a lot into sweetness. One of the things that's interesting, if you're not a Scotch drinker, Scotch is much, much more complex than bourbon. Scotch is much more complex than most American whiskeys I've had, in that there's many, many layers. Now, interestingly enough, a lot of these, they'll actually age in used bourbon barrels. So remember, a bourbon barrel bourbon has to be aged in new charred oak barrels. Well, once those charred oak barrels have been used, they're not bourbon barrels anymore. So oftentimes they'll send those barrels over and they'll age Scotch in those barrels. And you can taste the oak, you can taste the smoke, you can taste the peat, but then there's sweetness that kind of lingers behind it. So a really, really good one. Not an overly expensive Scotch, but I will say this is not one that I want to put over ice. I think over ice it tends to dilute the complex flavors a little bit too much. So, while we're drinking Scotch, I'll continue to enjoy my wee dram as we talk about what happened with Brexit. But this is I think if you want a little bit more complex flavors, multiple layers, Laphroaig quarter cask, it's not going to overpower you with smoke. It's not something like I think we've got a Lagavulin 16 year back here, so that'll be maybe the next one when we go in with a Scotch. But it's not as strong as a lot of them, but it's got a lot of complex flavors. So I think give this one a roll. So let's talk about Brexit and kind of where it came from and what happened. So Brexit was a vote for the members of the United Kingdom to decide whether or not they wanted to leave the European Union. And why would they want to leave the European Union? Well, proponents that wanted to leave the European Union were talking about the fact that there weren't enough jobs in the European Union, that there weren't enough, Great British jobs, UK jobs were leaving and they were going over to the EU, and then the immigration was way too open and their borders were too open and they wanted more secure borders, and that they really wanted to get back to a national pride in the UK. And so pretty much every pollster around the world thought that this was a ridiculous sentiment and that there was no chance that they were going to leave the European Union. Matter of fact, here's a map of everybody who voted and kind of how they voted and where they voted. And notice where our Laphroaig comes from. They wanted to stay. Matter of fact, Scotland was the biggest area that wanted to stay. So Scotland, 62% of Scotland wanted to stay. I think London was split 60-40. But you see the countryside, if you will, the areas that were outside of London and outside of Scotland was definitely more towards was leaving the European Union. Now, the pollsters in this case were completely wrong because they felt like it was going to be a landslide as to remain in the European Union. Now, I don't know if this has ever happened anywhere else. Oh, maybe the pollsters aren't always right. It's actually interesting how much leaving the European Union resembled the United States presidential election in a lot of the talking points. Right now, I'm in no way getting political here. Lord knows I don't want to start a fire of comments down below. But the point is, the pollsters aren't always right. And I think that the pollsters aren't always right because it's not always popular to say what you want to do. But then when the polls are closed and there's nobody to look over your shoulder, you're going to vote the way you feel. And I think that's kind of what happened in the UK. So now the UK is left dealing with it. Now they've got to say, okay, how do we leave? And so it comes back to, I love the old Howie Mandel show, deal or no deal. And isn't it ironic, by the way, that somebody who was on the Deal or No Deal is now kind of a princess, if I'm not mistaken. But anyway, I digress. So deal or no deal. Are they going to have a deal when they leave the European Union? And so this is really the big talk that's been on the table very recently. And if we go and look at the timeline, let me put this timeline up and give you a moment to take a gander while I take a wee dram. So in March of 2017, the UK triggered, okay, we're going to leave the EU in 2 years. So they were supposed to leave the EU in March of 2019. And Theresa May was working hard, Prime Minister Theresa May was working hard to get a deal with the European Union that would also go through Parliament. Now the other side of this is there's a certain faction of the UK's Parliament that says we're going to block Brexit at all costs. We don't want to leave. And there are those who said, well, no, we took a referendum and a vote, we have to leave. So Prime Minister Boris Johnson came in a couple of months ago and said, we're leaving on October 31st. So the March date came and went, and they got an extension from the EU to stay a bit longer to see if they could come up with a deal. And Boris Johnson came in and just hardlined and said, we're leaving October 31st, which is when our extension expires, deal or no deal. And so, Boris Johnson said, we're going to leave, and whether we have a deal or not. And he's been working hard to try to get a deal into place, and had what he thought was going to be a good deal that immediately everybody knew that it was not going to pass Parliament. Parliament voted it down almost immediately in like a super Saturday session of Parliament. Say that 5 times fast, a super Saturday session of Parliament. And so, Boris Johnson dug his heels in and he says, nope, we're leaving. It's going to happen. It's what's going to happen. But let's put another vote out there. And Parliament came out and said, nope, we're not voting again. You need to get a better deal. And so they're still working on a deal, and really Parliament's dug in their heels and they're calling Boris Johnson's bluff. And Boris Johnson's saying, listen, maybe we're not going to leave. So now, as of now that I'm recording, he's looking for another extension on the deal. And so I guess that October 31st, deal or no deal, we're leaving, I guess they called his bluff, because it looks like they're going to block that leaving with no deal. But what would no deal mean, right? And you hear that a lot, right? Deal versus no deal. What does no deal mean? And what's funny is when I hear the no deal, almost everything
has to do with going on holiday. It's amazing how much the UK loves going on holiday, because it just seems like most of their concerns are around going on holiday. But anyway, the first and largest and most obvious is that there will be customs and tariffs on imports into the UK that don't currently exist. So right now, the EU, the European Union, is obviously the United Kingdom's largest trade partner, both imports and exports. And immediately there would be instantaneous tariffs and taxes on goods both in and out. Now that would pass on to the consumer, and the consumer would face a lot more. And there's fear that that would send the UK into a recession overall. Now, President Trump has said that once they leave the EU, we will give them a great deal. We will give them an amazing deal, trade deal, and that's currently because the U.S. has a trade surplus with the UK. But they can't hang their heads on that, although the United States is the second largest trading partner for the UK. But that's the biggest and most pressing, is going to be the taxes and the tariffs on imports and exports, and how that's going to affect the individual pocket, even the food supply. Most of the UK's food supply comes from the UK, but the second largest amount, about 28% from what I could find, comes from the European Union. So they get a lot of food from the EU that will cause just a rise in prices in food and in energy and in the overall cost of living inside of there. Now, everything else to me kind of boils back to going on holiday. The travel restrictions will be a lot harder to go from country to country. They'll have to cross the border a lot more, a little less freely than they have, although the Ireland borders will remain open. If they go on holiday, their European insurance card for other countries' medical coverage is not going to be effective. It's not going to work. And so the deal was to try to get all of these issues hammered out. And right now, that deal is just not there. Do they leave without a deal? And they may leave without a deal. Now, this has created an entire industry, by the way, in the UK. In doing my research for this session today, it created an entire industry of companies that are preparing their clients for a no-deal exit. But we've got to talk about it from a market perspective. What does it mean to the U.S. economy, and how is that going to affect what it is that we do? So, recent article in CNBC talked about what a Brexit could mean for the U.S. economy. Now, I found another article. I didn't grab a picture of it, but it was an opinion article from January 4th of 2019, and it said investors. It was an opinion article on CNBC. It said Market Watch. Investors should stay away from U.S. stocks while Brexit is looming. Well, had you done that, you've missed out on a tremendous gain. And so let's talk about what happened on the referendum vote itself. So taking a look at this chart of the Great British Pound and the U.S. dollar, we can see that back in 2016, there's the one candle with the huge wick. That was on the referendum date. The U.S. markets that day dropped 3%. Now, the 3% drop in the U.S. markets on that day was a pretty big drop, but it turned out just to be a buying opportunity. And so, when we look at this, we've got to start to look at it from the Great British Pound perspective. So this is a monthly chart of the pound. And we can see that before the referendum, the pound was already in a pretty big downtrend. Let's go ahead and slide over and take a look at a weekly chart. And take a look especially at the last part of this weekly chart. The last few weeks, we've seen that the pound has started to gain some momentum back to the upside. Matter of fact, we've put in a higher swing high and a higher swing low. And on a daily chart, it looks nearly parabolic. Straight up move over the last few weeks, heading into that deal or no deal scenario. Now, why is that? I think that we could continue to see a bit of a rise. And when I look at this chart, I see only two major supply areas. We talked about getting long when it looked like it was forming a base a couple of weeks ago, and it's rallied up nicely from there. We're actually approaching a supply area right now. So for shorter term investors and traders, I think there's an opportunity for price if it's into this supply area to maybe take a couple of a day smaller movement. If we break through there, I think there's lots of room for this thing to run up to that 1.4 area. And if we run up to that 1.4 area, that's where I see us kind of settling off. I think that could be a good opportunity. to get short in that level. But if we break through what's above us, there's really nothing to stop us up until that 1.4 area. Now, to the US markets, I think if we get a no deal exit, it's going to hurt our markets. We're going to take a hit. But that to me just is a bigger buying opportunity in a bullish market. Now, our volume has gone down recently in the US markets, just I think a large part due to the uncertainty. But I wouldn't be overly cautious. I would use the Brexit if we get a pullback in the US markets as a buying opportunity in the US markets, and I would go with the trend in the pound dollar. So hopefully that answers a little bit of your questions around Brexit. The thing that I would say is don't let it paralyze your trading. Let the market still come to you, identify quality levels of demand and supply, and you're still going to have better opportunities overall. And if you're looking for a good scotch, remember I highly recommend Laphroaig Quarter Cask. By the way, if you get a bottle of Laphroaig Quarter Cask, you can become what's called Friends of Laphroaig, and you get a 1 square foot piece of land. So I am now the proud owner of 1 square foot of land on the island of Isla, and so take that. Maybe I can apply for dual citizenship. I don't know. Do me a favor. In the comment section down below, what do you think is going to happen on Brexit? What do you think the U.S. markets are going to do? I think we may get a bit of a pullback, which can turn into a buying opportunity so long as we have some underlying fundamental strength in the U.S. economy. But I'd like to hear what you have to say. And then also, if you've got a stock you want me to analyze or you've got a spirit you want me to look at, leave that in the comment section down below. Until next week, everybody, cheers.